Hi, this is Nee. I'm the Marketing and Communications Specialist at CARE.
I'm Melissa. I'm one of the violence prevention coordinators at CARE, and you are listening to The Narrative Project.
You know, one comment, and I don't know if anybody else has heard this comment, and I've only heard it from a handful of men, is this idea of, well, because of the Me Too movement, I can't even go up to someone at a bar. It seemed at the time the conversations I have heard were around these heterosexual relationships, but this idea of just fear of anybody's just going to turn around and accuse me of something, like that, it was almost like it's not a real problem. Women, it seemed to be, at least how I was hearing it, women in general were just going to be so quick to call anybody an abuser, rather than an acknowledgement of like, oh my God, sexual violence is this pervasive, that there's this many people saying this happened to them. I almost felt like what I was hearing, and maybe, I don't know if any of you shared this, but what I started hearing was this lash of what I was hearing from heterosexual men of, now I can't ask anybody on a date.
I just feel like there's so much male privilege in that. And I've been like, I don't know, I just can't stop thinking about this. And I have an older sister and a younger brother. And when I was going to college, I never got to talk about, like if you're sexually assaulted, like, we're here for you type of thing, my family. But when my brother went to college, he got a whole talk from my parents about how he could be wrongfully accused of sexual assault to make sure he did not have sex while under the influence of alcohol. And I just sat there like, I'm like, yes, but are you kidding me? Like, yes, don't do that. But also at the same time, like, believe women, because women aren't lying. And I do think that's valid. And the fact that we're trying to victimize men, being like, oh, men are just being falsely accused of raping women all the time. No, that's not exactly what's happening. Like that stat again, that's only happening to 2 to 8% of men. The rest of it, they're actually being rightfully accused. And I think the women deserve justice for it.
Yeah. I mean, it's so funny because that's absolutely what I'm hearing is this, like, it should be don't do that because it's wrong, not don't do that because, so you're doing something wrong and then you're wrongfully accused. You just did something wrong. So it's like this idea of like I remember my brother making comment, because my youngest is a boy, said something like, educate your son not to. I'm like, I am hoping I am raising a child that wouldn't want to have sex with somebody who is fast asleep. Like, that just seems like something like you just shouldn't do that. Not because if you do that, bad things will happen to you. The conversation should just back it up. We just don't do that.
Yeah, because you're harming someone else. This is just kind of about the same way we want to use, the right pronouns, the same way we want to just protect, and make sure we're not offending each other at the same kind of rate. Let's not offend each other's bodies at the same time. If it's not yours, don't touch it. And I think that's just such a strange concept. And I think a lot of growing up in a very, I think this is also a lot of white people do this to, a lot of white cis heterosexual men. And I grew up in that crowd where there was a lot of those. And it's hereditary. It's one of those things where if you teach your kid this, they're going to do it. And they're going to pass it on. And this cycle is not going to end. And I don't think Me Too really changed that perspective for men. I think it made them feel like they were victims in a situation. And especially because during Me Too, some men were called out. I don't think a lot were. Mostly it was just to make women feel like they weren't alone in this situation. And I think that worked. I feel like when I read posts, I was like, wow, I'm not alone. That's really cool. But I think the biggest part is that I just saw so many white cis heterosexual men coming out like, I'm the victim, I didn't mean to rape you, blah, 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 I didn't do that. But they don't even realize that they did in the first place. And that's what makes me so grossed out.
Well, I think maybe that's what Me Too was lacking, or didn't come from it, that I would have liked to see, is I did not see it give a lot of people pause to just self-reflect and say, could I have ever done something that maybe was offensive? And maybe I can't go back in time and undo it, but I can change how I interact moving forward. And instead, I think it made individuals who almost defensive. I don't know that they're genuinely fearful, but they're just defensive. And I think some of that goes back to media. So for example, the 16 Candles, I think is perfect just because it's an older movie. And, again, when it came out, that was completely acceptable. That was what a school dance looked like. Somebody passed out, maybe they ended up in a car. I think there was another movie that I grew up with. I can't remember what it was. I can picture it. There's another one of those like high school coming of age movies. And like, there was always somebody passed out, being kind of like passed off. And that was considered okay. So now going to individuals who maybe were part of similar scenarios and saying how wrong that was, they feel defensive. It's not being portrayed as wrong. It's being portrayed as normal. And these things aren't normal.
In our conversation, like, I'm thinking around this aspect too of folks getting defensive rather than having that reflection. But then it only, and specifically with the Me Too movement as well, in other spaces too, this concept of a survivor of sexual assault looks a specific way. And typically that way, it's a white, cis, heterosexual woman is typically what the imagery that was being depicted. And like, it created this gap where I remember I have a lot of men in my life that have been victimized. And I have a lot of folks that identify as trans, a lot of folks who don't identify as white, people of color, folks with disabilities. Like, I can just make the list like super long, as long as I would like to. They were removed from the conversation in the broader eye of things. And the conversation too, I was having this thought process when thinking about consent education. And there's definitely that aspect, I think, Abby, that you were talking about, of where people don't even realize that they violated someone. And then there's also this aspect of they know full well what they're doing. And you have these two sides to when people are perpetrating. You have folks that are doing it because they want to exert power, they want that control, and no amount of education is necessarily going to prevent it, because they know in our society today, more than likely, they probably will be able to get away with it, and they want that power. And then there's also the side of things where people aren't even aware, because we don't talk about what it means to violate someone's body. And we objectify humans way more than we ever should, especially in the media. And so I'm thinking also around these lines of how do we open up the conversation so it's not just this one group that is kind of, because I don't think that if you were to say that sexual assault only happens to this specific demographic, there probably would not be a large group of people agreeing with that statement.
Right.
And we don't talk about other demographics, especially with the aspect of the vulnerabilities that social structures create that actually make it more prevalent that folks that are outside of that group of a white, cis, heterosexual woman can be more vulnerable to these forms of violence. And we leave that out of the conversation. I think that is another gap, that we are not having that reflection. We're not having those thoughts. We're having conversations of, okay, make sure that you don't get accused, rather than make sure you don't do harm. Or even, I remember, I have two brothers. While I don't identify as a woman, I was raised with that identity. And I remember when I went off to college, I had the conversation of where my mom sat me down and was like, these are all of the things that you need to make sure you do so you're not a victim. And my brothers didn't get any form of a conversation similar to that or anything like that. And so I think we see these two sides as well, where you're either being told, don't be victimized, or you're being told don't get accused. No one's having the conversation of don't do it, which is interesting.
I definitely see that there's this double standard. I remember when I was going into my first year of college, my dad especially, he was very fearful. Prior to college, I was a survivor of sexual violence. I'd experienced that as a child and gone through all of the procedures around law enforcement and everything. And so he was extremely fearful of that happening again. And I remember being taught to, if I go to a party, always have my hand over my drink, always cover my drink. Never leave my drink at a table, at a party alone. Never go to a party alone. Always walk on campus with someone else. At UC Santa Cruz, we're in the middle of the redwood forest. And so it can be really scary at night, even if you're with a group of people, but I feel like media always has this like depiction of, oh, the attacker's going to come from the bushes. So that intensified my fear. But the fact is, like, that's not typically how these cases happen or how cases happen in general. It's a person and yeah, there's always that double standard. I don't have any brothers or, brothers myself, but I have heard of, friends of mine who were taught, oh, like, you need to make sure you're like not putting yourself in situations that could get you in trouble. But it's also like, how do you educate these individuals who may harm others to not do that? I think it's an interesting conversation of like upbringing and knowing better, because we should know better. People should know better not to put their hands on another individual without their consent. And I think it could be due to a lack of, education. I know that Abby had mentioned that it's hereditary in a way, and I agree with that of, if a person in their family has committed this sort of act and they emulate that behavior and normalize that behavior, it's going to persist generational forms. And so, I agree. There's always this double standard that I see, and I think it should definitely be addressed, in media. And, that's why it's so important to be having dialogues like we are now.
I agree. And I think to Melissa's point, we should make an effort to make movements more inclusive, because Me Too really, at least the images I was seeing, really portrayed cis females being attacked by cis men. And the Me Too movement should be inclusive of the transgender communities. It should be inclusive of gay and lesbian communities. It should be inclusive of individuals who maybe don't identify one way or the other. It should be inclusive of everybody, and it should be everybody against violence, period. And in general, I think some of these movements are a little bit more exclusive than they should be. We should stand with these individuals. These individuals shouldn't have to stand alone as, a minority group that deals with violence. They should be included in the Me Too movement, even given thought to the civil rights movement in the 60s. And one mistake that women made is we should have, when we were fighting for our own rights, why weren't we fighting for minority rights? Why weren't we fighting for the rights of everybody? Because we were dealing with it. And I think part of that is that idea of everybody at the top, like they say nurses eat their young, like this idea. And one of the thoughts is almost this idea of, if you've had to take orders, if you've been, seen in society as like below a physician in my profession, for example, then you almost have this desire to enact power over anybody else. And I think we still see those kind of power plays take place where you want to be above somebody instead of wanting to just be against violence as a whole to individuals and everybody just being treated with respect. The Me Too movement wasn't asking for accolades for being a survivor. It was just asking for individuals to acknowledge that this is a real problem. And I don't know that I saw that come out of it, where, you had women standing up and being there for their girls, but I didn't see it being like a real movement against violence where there was meaningful movement towards standing up for all individuals facing or trying to confront violence in their lives.
I feel like what needs to happen next is just like back to Melissa's point, like education. Where does that start? And obviously that's got to be more inclusive, because Me Too didn't do that. And whether it's a social media movement or not, it needs to be inclusive of everyone. And that doesn't just mean, that means the range of sexes that we have, genders, as well as, sexuality. And I think that's something that's really not discussed very often too in sex ed that we do. And I think that can come across obviously in social media, in different movies, TV shows. And I think actually Sex Ed, the show, has done a really good job of that. But I always come back to this one experience that I had working in an 8th grade classroom. They had it was a science class and they did health in the class. So they had sex ed, but the teacher refused to do the new sex ed curriculum that included a wider range of sexuality teaching. I don't know exactly what I incorporated, but I had 2 pansexual students come up to me saying they didn't talk about homosexual based sex. I put quotes on that. But I think that's really interesting too, because when we talk about consent, when we talk about different types of sexuality and safe sex, there's a lot of things that don't really come up. And in my sex ed classes, we didn't really talk about consent. And I think maybe that's where this all really stems from. I think that's weird now that I think about it. But consent wasn't what we talked about. We just talked about use condoms, don't get pregnant, just the generic mean girl stuff. And I think it's really weird. So maybe is that where we start next? Because it needs to be more inclusive for sure. And it also needs to be effective too. As much as I really want to Pride Me Too, there was a lot of things I think we've mentioned that did not do well. And as a white straight woman, I think I didn't see as many of these things before too, that it wasn't really inclusive. And I really didn't participate. I just watched. So I think now moving forward, what can we do to be more inclusive and educate? That's the bottom line. People need education.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And your whole bringing up the Me Too movement and your experiences with it as a kind of person not necessarily participating in it reminded me of my own experiences. I'm a Guatemalan. I'm not white. I don't consider myself cis, but I remember during that time I posted a story about my childhood, sexual violence and what had happened to me. And just the amount of support that I had rallied around me after that was immense. I had never gotten so many direct messages from people that I barely talked to. I passed in class a few times in high school that I'd never really spoken to, but they had personally messaged me and stated, and this was, it was people of color. It was specifically, one interesting thing about this is a male friend of mine actually messaged me and mentioned and talked about me personally and said, hey, you're the inspiration for me posting my story. I want to thank you for posting yours. Mm-hmm. And I felt so much just love and compassion during that time, and for everybody who had, was posting their stories, and those who weren't, those who were just watching, and those who were just standing and kind of absorbing their stories, but recognizing that they are a survivor. And whether they choose to call themselves a survivor or use the verbiage of victim, it's up to them. And at the end of the day, I think education could start at the school level. I completely agree. My 5th grade or 8th grade sex education was very lacking. We never even really formally learned how to use condoms in high school. We just learned about the menstrual cycle and how our bodies were changing, which was so baffling to me. I think it starts at, at the educational level, schools, but I think it also starts at the individual level. Mm-hmm. How are we teaching ourselves, and how are we, taking in information and not necessarily regurgitating that, but learning from our experiences and learning from what other people are telling us and teaching us as well. Because if we're not absorbing that education and that information, and it's just leaving through one ear out the other, we're not going to be better in society, and we're going, sexual violence is still going to continue to be pervasive as it is now. And so I agree. I think it needs to start at both the individual and the school system level of education and educating people.
Thank you so much, Angelica. I completely agree that it needs to start both at the individual level and at the school level and beyond that, right? I wanted to pose a question for you all, and this is our final question. But if you could reimagine our world, what would it look like for each of you?
I think the first thing that came to mind for me is I would picture a world where I would feel safe to walk outside of my house at night. And that sounds so like such a simple thing, but growing up and living as a woman in the world, or even a person who has experienced violence. You don't have to be a woman to experience violence. Being a person in the world who has previously experienced violence, the whole idea of walking outside of my apartment has become something that makes me fearful. I think that that's something simple, but I think that's what I would want to live in a world where I feel safe walking outside of my home, and doing just mundane tasks that I don't necessarily feel safe doing now. Yeah, like doing the laundry, or going for a night drive, or walking my pets, and not having to worry about people approaching me or talking to me when I'm not interested.
I want to feel safe. I feel like anyone should feel safe, and that no matter who you are or how you identify. It's just living in a world where you're so feared of being assaulted or harassed by any means is not okay, and that's the world we live in right now.
When I think of a world, like if I could reimagine the world, like wave a magic wand and ta-da, I would want to get rid of a lot of the toxicity that exists within our culture, of whether you see that within this aspect of requiring hyper masculinity or requiring even hyper femininity, and being able to just let people exist however they wish to exist in a way that doesn't encroach on others, and being able to have everyone feel safe, have everyone feel as though they belong, and they don't need to do this lengthy explanation on why they're deserving of that, and really just be able to be. There's a lot of privilege in the aspect of just being able to like be who you are and be confident in that, and being able to like not have to worry about it. And I wish that that privilege could be given to everyone, because we know that that's not necessarily the case. And I think getting rid of a lot of that toxicity that exists would allow for people to just be.
I definitely agree with Mel, and I was thinking along the same lines of living in a world where we don't have to explain ourselves, right? Where we don't have to say that could be your mom, that could be your brother, that could be your dad, or whatever, right? But just be, and being able to navigate the world where everyone is compassionate and kind and demonstrating respect, and where people can thrive and be themselves, who they are authentically. So that's the world that I'm imagining. And I do genuinely believe that while we may not completely be where we want to be right now, I do believe that that world can exist.
I would just like individuals to recognize that we don't necessarily need to understand it or to get it. You just need to be cool with it. There are things that other individuals believe that I might not be able to wrap my head around, and I might not be able to completely understand it, but I just need to respect that that's where they're coming from. I think there's, oftentimes this expectation that to respect something, to want to treat something as an equal, you need to get it. You need to see what the genetics of it are, to understand why they are the way they are. And sometimes people just should be able to be, and that should be enough. It really doesn't matter, what's nature, what's nurture, what's like this idea that everybody needs to understand it to be able to recognize that individual, for example, with like gay marriage, this idea that, well, I don't really get it, as being a reason why two individuals shouldn't be able to get married. And I kind of feel like it's not your thing to get. Like sometimes you just have to recognize like that's not anybody's job to help you get who they are or why they are the way they are. And if you feel like you get it, that's great, but it's not for you. It's not up to you to get somebody else to respect them. What I hope for my children is that, as they move through the world, they're able to have really diverse groups of friends where, it's not like everybody has to look the same, or, you should be able to be a jock and hang out at a different table just because that's your friend, and nobody has to get it. And you don't have to do all the same things to just enjoy doing particular activities together, whatever they may be. So I guess that's kind of what I hope for is, what my kids learn or get is that even if it doesn't look like what's going on in my household or what's going on in their auntie's or their uncle's household, doesn't mean that it's not something that they can respect and appreciate. And growing up, there's always fear. Oh, don't hang out with that group and don't hang out with this group. And sometimes it's warranted, you don't want your kids doing drugs or jumping off a cliff, but some of it I think is unwarranted fears of, you need to hang out with individuals who look the way that your parents think you should look, or whatever it might be. And I feel like, I don't know that that's necessary.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thanks for tuning into the Narrative Project podcast.
We hope you all enjoyed the dialogue we had today.
Please remember, should you need support from the care office, please call us at 949-824-7273 or email us at care@uci.edu. Our services are available to UCI students, staff, and faculty members Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. PST.
The UCI Counseling Center is available at 949-824-6457 and offers 24-hour access to counselors by phone.
And for Waymaker's 24-hour hotline, they can be contacted at 949-831-9110 in South Orange County or 714-957-2737 for North Orange County, and they can provide resources and referrals for survivors of sexual assault.
Human Auction's 24-hour hotline is available at 877-854-3594 and provides resources, safety, and support for individuals experiencing relationship abuse.
For those outside of Orange County, the National Sexual Assault Hotline can be reached at 1-800-656-4673 or through online chat at rain.org. That's RAINN.org for resources and referrals for survivors of sexual assault.
And the National Domestic Violence Hotline can be reached at 1-800-799-7233 or through online chat at thehotline.org. That's THEHOTLINE.org for resources and referrals for survivors of individuals experiencing relationship abuse.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode, please be sure to share it with someone you know and join us for our next conversation. Bye for now.